It was a quiet Thursday evening in October 2019 when Pastor Robert Matthews returned home early from what was supposed to be an overnight church conference in Birmingham. The 45-year-old minister had been feeling unwell and decided to drive the 2 hours back to his modest home in Culman, Alabama, rather than spend another night away from his family. As he pulled into his driveway at 9:30 p.m., Robert noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck parked across the street, but thought nothing of it. After all, this was a quiet residential neighborhood where visitors often parked wherever they could find space. Robert quietly entered through the front door, not wanting to wake his wife Sarah if she had already gone to bed. The house was unusually quiet, with only a faint glow coming from the upstairs bedroom window. As he climbed the stairs, carrying his overnight bag, Robert could hear muffled voices and what sounded like laughter coming from behind the closed bedroom door. Assuming Sarah was watching television or talking on the phone with one of her sisters, he gently turned the handle and pushed open the door. What Robert Matthews saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, in the bed he had shared with his wife for 18 years, was Sarah, completely naked, entangled with Thomas Bradley, a deacon from their church and someone Robert had considered one of his closest friends. The shock was so complete, so devastating, that Robert later said he felt as if the floor had literally disappeared beneath his feet. Sarah screamed and grabbed for the bedsheets while Thomas scrambled to find his clothes, stammering apologies and excuses that made no sense. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would transform Pastor Robert Matthews from a respected man of God into a criminal defendant facing life in prison. Because the gun that Robert kept in his bedside drawer for home protection was within arm's reach, and in his state of shock and rage, rational thought abandoned him completely. What happened next would turn a man of God into the center of a criminal investigation that would expose secrets, lies, and betrayal that went far deeper than anyone in their small Alabama town could have imagined. Welcome to Silent Witness True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Who was Pastor Robert Matthews? And how did a man who had dedicated his life to preaching forgiveness and turning the other cheek become consumed by rage in a single moment? Who was Sarah Matthews, the pastor's wife who had been living a double life right under the nose of an entire congregation? And who was Thomas Bradley, the trusted deacon whose betrayal would shatter not just a marriage, but an entire community's faith? These questions would consume investigators, legal experts, and the people of Culman, Alabama for months to come. Was this a crime of passion that erupted in a moment of devastating discovery? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect Christian family? And how did a respected Alabama pastor become a headline no one saw coming? As we peel back the layers of this shocking case, we'll discover that the events of that October evening were just the tip of an iceberg of deception, manipulation, and betrayal that had been building for years. The truth about what really happened in that bedroom and in the minutes that followed will challenge everything you think you know about trust, faith, and the capacity for violence that exists even in those we consider the most righteous among us. Because this story has twists and revelations that will leave you questioning whether justice was truly served, and whether any of the people involved were really who they claimed to be. To understand how a night of betrayal turned into a tragedy that would destroy multiple families, we need to go back to the beginning, to the small town of Culman, Alabama, where Robert Matthews had built what everyone believed was an exemplary life. Culman sits in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, a town of about 15,000 people where sweet tea flows as freely as conversation, and where Sunday church attendance is still considered a cornerstone of respectability. Robert Matthews had arrived in Culman 12 years earlier to take over as senior pastor of Grace Community Baptist Church, a growing congregation of about 400 members. He came with impressive credentials, having graduated from Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville and served successfully at churches in Georgia and Tennessee. But more than his education or experience, it was Robert's genuine warmth and pastoral heart that won over the people of Culman. He had a gift for making biblical teachings feel relevant to everyday life, and his sermons were filled with humor, compassion, and practical wisdom that resonated with everyone from teenagers to senior citizens. Robert's personal life seemed to mirror the values he preached from the pulpit. He had been married to Sarah for 18 years, and together they had raised 2 children, Michael, now 21 and serving in the Army, and Jennifer, 19, and attending Auburn University on a partial academic scholarship. The family was active in every aspect of church life, from organizing community service projects to hosting the annual church picnic in their backyard. Robert coached Little League baseball in the summer and organized men's fishing trips that had become legendary in the community for their combination of outdoor adventure and spiritual fellowship. Sarah Matthews seemed to be the perfect pastor's wife. At 42, she was still strikingly beautiful, with auburn hair and a smile that made everyone feel welcome. She taught Sunday school to the high school students, coordinated the church's food pantry for struggling families, and somehow managed to remember the names and personal concerns of hundreds of congregation members. Sarah worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a local accounting firm, but her true passion seemed to be supporting her husband's ministry and caring for the needs of their church family. The Matthews family lived in a comfortable but modest ranch-style home about 10 minutes from the church, in a neighborhood filled with other professional families. Their house was always open to church members who needed counseling, young couples preparing for marriage, or anyone who just needed a friendly ear and a home-cooked meal. Sarah was famous throughout the congregation for her chocolate chip cookies and her ability to make anyone feel like part of the family. But behind this picture of domestic bliss and spiritual leadership, cracks had been forming for years. Friends who knew the couple well later admitted that they had noticed subtle changes in Sarah's behavior over the past year. She had become more critical of Robert in social settings, making sharp comments about his appearance or his decision-making that went beyond the gentle teasing that was normal for their relationship. She had also begun spending more time away from home, claiming she needed space to pursue personal interests and friendships outside of the church community. Robert, meanwhile, had thrown himself even more deeply into his pastoral duties, perhaps as a way of avoiding the growing tension in his marriage. He had taken on additional responsibilities within the Regional Baptist Association, was writing a book about small-town ministry, and had begun counseling couples from other churches in surrounding communities. His schedule had become so packed that he was rarely home except to sleep, a fact that Sarah had begun to resent openly. Thomas Bradley entered this story as someone who seemed to be the solution to the Matthews family's growing problems. Thomas was 51 years old, a successful contractor who owned his own business and had been a member of Grace Community Baptist for nearly as long as Robert had been the pastor. He was divorced, having gone through what he described as an amicable split from his ex-wife 5 years earlier, when their children graduated from high school and moved away for college. Thomas lived alone in a large house on the outskirts of town, was financially secure, and had become one of the church's most generous donors. More importantly, Thomas had become Robert's closest friend and most trusted advisor. The two men shared a love of hunting and fishing, and Thomas had essentially become Robert's retreat partner, organizing weekend trips to remote cabins where Robert could decompress from the pressures of pastoral life. Thomas was also a deacon, serving on the church board and helping to make important decisions about church finances, building maintenance, and long-term planning. Robert trusted Thomas completely, often seeking his counsel on sensitive matters involving church members and even personal family decisions. What Robert didn't know was that Thomas had been growing closer to Sarah during those long evenings when Robert was busy with church business. It had started innocently enough, with Thomas stopping by the house to pick up Robert for their outdoor adventures or to discuss church matters. When Robert wasn't home, Sarah would invite Thomas in for coffee, and their conversations gradually became more personal and intimate. Thomas was a good listener, and Sarah found herself sharing frustrations about her marriage, her feelings of loneliness, and her growing sense that she had lost her individual identity in the role of pastor's wife. The affair had been going on for 8 months by the time Robert discovered them together. What had begun as emotional intimacy had gradually progressed to physical encounters, carefully planned around Robert's schedule and conducted with the kind of discretion that comes from deep knowledge of someone's habits and routines. They met at Thomas's house when Robert was conducting evening counseling sessions, took weekend trips to nearby cities when Robert was attending conferences or revival meetings, and had even managed to spend entire afternoons together when Robert was visiting sick church members or attending denominational meetings. The deception required careful planning and constant communication. Sarah and Thomas had developed elaborate systems for arranging their meetings, using coded text messages and predetermined signals to avoid detection. They had also created plausible explanations for their frequent contact, with Thomas often calling the house under the pretense of discussing church business or planning outdoor activities with Robert. The affair had become so consuming that both Sarah and Thomas later admitted they had begun planning a future together, discussing divorce, relocation, and the possibility of starting over in a new community where no one knew their history. But their careful planning hadn't accounted for Robert's unexpected return home that October evening. The church conference he was attending had been scheduled to run until Friday afternoon, giving Sarah and Thomas what they thought would be a safe opportunity to spend the night together in the comfort of the Matthews home. They had grown careless, perhaps overconfident in their ability to predict and control Robert's movements. That overconfidence would prove to be a fatal mistake, leading to a confrontation that would destroy not just their secret relationship, but multiple lives and an entire community's sense of security and trust. The silence that followed Robert's discovery of his wife and best friend together lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in that bedroom. Sarah's screams had died away, replaced by a terrible quiet as the three people who had been closest to each other for years found themselves in a situation that none of them had ever imagined. Robert stood frozen in the doorway, his overnight bag still in his hand, trying to process what he was seeing. Thomas had managed to pull on his pants but remained shirtless, his face pale with shock and fear. Sarah had wrapped the bedsheet around herself and was sitting on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. According to the testimony that would later be given in court, it was Thomas who broke the silence first, stammering out words that were meant to be an apology but came out as a confused mixture of explanations and excuses. He claimed that he and Sarah had been talking about Robert's increasing absence from home, that the conversation had become emotional, that things had gotten out of hand in a way that neither of them had planned. Even as he spoke, Thomas was moving slowly toward the bedroom door, perhaps hoping to escape the volatile situation before it escalated further. Robert's response was initially controlled, almost eerily calm. He set down his overnight bag and asked, in a voice that several neighbors later said they could hear through the windows, how long the affair had been going on. When neither Sarah nor Thomas answered immediately, Robert repeated the question, his voice rising slightly but still maintaining what sounded like pastoral composure. It was Sarah who finally answered, admitting through her tears that she and Thomas had been seeing each other for several months. What happened next was disputed in the court proceedings that followed, with different witnesses giving conflicting accounts of the sequence of events. What is certain is that Robert walked to the bedside table where he kept a .38 caliber revolver in the top drawer, a gun he had owned for home protection but had never fired outside of a shooting range. Thomas, seeing Robert reach for the drawer, began to plead with his former friend, insisting that he was leaving, that this didn't have to escalate, that they could work things out like rational adults. But 18 years of marriage, 12 years of friendship, and a lifetime of trust had been shattered in a single moment, and Robert Matthews was no longer thinking rationally. He removed the gun from the drawer and pointed it at Thomas, who immediately raised his hands and began backing toward the bedroom window. Sarah was now sobbing uncontrollably, begging Robert to put the gun down, promising that she would end the affair, that they could work through this crisis together. The first shot was fired at 9:47 p.m., according to neighbors who called 911 after hearing what they initially thought might have been a car backfiring. The bullet struck Thomas Bradley in the chest, sending him stumbling backward against the bedroom wall. He slid down to the floor, conscious but bleeding heavily, and managed to gasp out one last plea for mercy before Robert fired the second shot, this one striking Thomas in the head and killing him instantly. Sarah's screams could be heard throughout the neighborhood as Robert stood over Thomas's body, the smoking gun still in his hand. According to Sarah's later testimony, Robert then turned the weapon on her, pointing it at her head while she begged for her life. She claimed that Robert seemed to be wrestling with himself, alternating between rage and what looked like confusion or shock at what he had just done. The gun wavered in his hand as he struggled to decide whether to kill the woman who had been his wife, his partner in ministry, and the mother of his children. It was the sound of approaching sirens that seemed to snap Robert out of his trance-like state. One of the neighbors had called 911 after hearing the gunshots, and Culman Police Department officers were already responding to reports of possible domestic violence at the Matthews residence. Robert lowered the gun and walked to the bedroom window, looking out at the flashing lights that were approaching his house. When the first officers arrived, they found Robert sitting on his front porch steps, the murder weapon on the ground beside him, waiting to surrender. The crime scene that officers discovered inside the house was devastating in its implications for everyone involved. Thomas Bradley's body lay in a pool of blood in the master bedroom, having died from what the medical examiner later determined were 2 gunshot wounds, either of which would have been fatal. Sarah was found huddled in the corner of the bedroom, still wrapped in the bedsheet, in a state of severe emotional shock that required immediate medical attention. The bedroom showed clear signs of the intimate encounter that had been interrupted, with clothing scattered across the floor and the bed in obvious disarray. Robert cooperated fully with the arresting officers, making no attempt to resist or deny what he had done. When read his Miranda rights, he waived his right to remain silent and gave a complete confession, describing the events of the evening in methodical detail that suggested he understood the gravity of what had occurred. He expressed what seemed to be genuine remorse for taking Thomas's life, but also stated that he felt completely betrayed by the 2 people he had trusted most in the world. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of Sarah and Thomas's deception, uncovering months of secret meetings, coded communications, and elaborate plans to be together. Phone records showed hundreds of text messages between the 2 lovers, many sent during church services or family gatherings. Hotel receipts revealed weekend getaways that had been hidden from Robert through lies about visiting relatives or attending women's church conferences. The affair hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained relationship that had required constant deception and planning. But what investigators discovered about the deeper dynamics of the Matthews marriage would prove to be even more shocking than the affair itself. Interviews with friends, family members, and church congregants revealed that Robert and Sarah's marriage had been deteriorating for years, with both parties engaging in behavior that painted a very different picture of their public image as the perfect pastoral family. The case was about to take turns that would surprise even the experienced detectives handling the investigation. But what the pastor did next would not only destroy his marriage and his ministry, it would destroy his freedom and expose secrets that went far deeper than anyone in Culman, Alabama could have imagined. Mid-video CTA. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's really following the story. The news of the shooting at the Matthews house spread through Culman like wildfire, with most residents learning about the tragedy before sunrise on Friday morning. Grace Community Baptist Church, which should have been preparing for their regular Friday evening fellowship dinner, instead found itself at the center of a media storm that would attract reporters from across Alabama and beyond. The image of their beloved pastor being led away in handcuffs was broadcast on every local news station, creating a sense of shock and disbelief that permeated the entire community. Detective Lisa Henderson of the Culman Police Department had been investigating domestic violence cases for over a decade, but the Matthews case presented unique challenges that went beyond the usual husband-wife conflicts she was accustomed to handling. This involved not just the destruction of a marriage, but the shattering of an entire religious community's faith in their spiritual leader. The victim wasn't a stranger or casual acquaintance, but someone who had been Robert's closest friend and most trusted advisor. The first phase of the investigation focused on establishing the timeline of events and determining whether Robert's actions could be considered premeditated murder or a crime of passion. Security footage from a gas station near the church conference showed Robert purchasing coffee and snacks at 8:15 p.m., supporting his claim that he had left the conference early due to feeling unwell. His cell phone records showed that he had sent a text message to Sarah at 8:45 p.m., saying he was feeling better and would be home soon, a message that Sarah apparently never saw because she and Thomas were already together in the bedroom. The physical evidence at the scene told a story of spontaneous violence rather than premeditated murder. The gun had been stored in its usual location in the bedside drawer, and there was no indication that Robert had removed it before discovering the affair. Forensic analysis of the bullets and blood spatter patterns confirmed that both shots had been fired from close range, consistent with a confrontation that had escalated quickly rather than a planned execution. But as Detective Henderson dug deeper into the backgrounds of everyone involved, she began to uncover information that complicated the seemingly straightforward narrative of a betrayed husband's violent revenge. Interviews with church members, neighbors, and family friends revealed that the Matthews marriage had been troubled for far longer than anyone had realized, and that Robert's public image as a devoted husband and father masked some deeply concerning behavior patterns. Several church members came forward with information about Robert's increasingly controlling behavior toward Sarah in the months leading up to the shooting. They described incidents where Robert had become inappropriately angry when Sarah expressed independent opinions during church meetings, had monitored her phone calls and text messages, and had begun restricting her activities outside of church-related functions. One particularly disturbing account came from a church secretary who reported that Robert had installed tracking software on Sarah's phone without her knowledge, claiming he was concerned about her safety, but actually monitoring her movements and communications. Even more troubling were revelations about Robert's treatment of Thomas Bradley and their friendship. While the two men had appeared close publicly, several people reported that Robert had become increasingly jealous and possessive of Thomas's time and attention. When Thomas began dating a woman from a neighboring town earlier that year, Robert had reportedly become hostile and had pressured Thomas to end the relationship, claiming it was interfering with his church responsibilities. The relationship had indeed ended, though Thomas never publicly stated whether Robert's interference was a factor. The investigation also revealed that Sarah had been seeking help for what she described as an increasingly difficult marriage for several months before the affair began. She had secretly consulted with a marriage counselor in Birmingham, had reached out to a domestic violence hotline on 2 separate occasions, and had even researched divorce procedures online. These actions painted a picture of a woman who felt trapped in her marriage and was desperately seeking a way out, possibly making her more vulnerable to Thomas's attention and affection. Thomas Bradley's background investigation revealed him to be a more complex figure than his public persona as a successful businessman and dedicated church member suggested. Financial records showed that his contracting business was actually struggling financially, with several major projects having gone over budget and resulted in costly legal disputes with clients. He had been borrowing money from church friends, including Robert, to keep his business afloat, creating financial stress that may have contributed to his emotional vulnerability. Even more significant was the discovery that Thomas had a history of relationships with married women, though none had involved members of his own church. His ex-wife, when interviewed by detectives, revealed that their divorce had been caused not by mutual agreement, as Thomas claimed, but by his affair with a married co-worker. She described Thomas as someone who was attracted to unavailable women and who seemed to enjoy the thrill and danger of secret relationships. The community's reaction to these revelations was mixed and often painful. Many church members felt betrayed not just by Robert's violence, but by the realization that their trusted spiritual leader had been deceiving them about the state of his marriage and his character. Others rallied to Robert's defense, arguing that he had been driven to temporary insanity by the devastating betrayal of his wife and best friend, and that his years of faithful service to the community should be taken into consideration. Sarah Matthews found herself in an impossible position, simultaneously grieving the loss of her lover, dealing with the trauma of witnessing his violent death, and facing the judgment of a community that viewed her as the catalyst for the tragedy. She was staying with her sister in Birmingham, having been advised by attorneys that remaining in Culman would be both emotionally and physically dangerous, given the intense media attention and community controversy surrounding the case. The children, Michael and Jennifer, were devastated by the destruction of their family and the revelation of secrets that had been hidden from them throughout their lives. Michael requested emergency leave from the Army to return home, only to find that home no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Jennifer withdrew from Auburn University for the semester, unable to concentrate on her studies while dealing with the reality that her father was facing murder charges and her mother was being vilified in the national media. The case was drawing attention from legal experts across the country, with many debating whether Robert's actions could be justified under Alabama's laws regarding crimes of passion. The state has provisions for reduced charges when murders occur in the heat of passion caused by adequate provocation, but the application of these laws to cases involving adultery had always been controversial and inconsistent. As the investigation continued, Detective Henderson began to suspect that the events of that October evening were part of a larger pattern of deception and manipulation that involved all three parties. Phone records revealed that Sarah and Thomas had been discussing the possibility of Robert discovering their affair, and had even talked about what they would do if such a confrontation occurred. Even more disturbing were indications that they may have been deliberately provoking Robert's jealousy and suspicion, possibly hoping to drive him to some kind of breakdown that would make their relationship more publicly acceptable. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come, as investigators uncovered evidence that would completely change their understanding of the relationships between all three people involved in this tragedy. Detectives soon uncovered evidence that turned the case upside down and revealed that the night of violence had been building toward this moment for far longer than anyone had realized. 6 weeks into the investigation, Detective Henderson received a phone call that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the Matthews case. The call came from Rebecca Martinez, a former member of Grace Community Baptist Church who had moved to Florida 2 years earlier, but had been following the case through news reports and social media. Rebecca had information that she claimed would change everything about how people understood what had happened between Robert, Sarah, and Thomas. According to Rebecca, she had been having an affair with Robert Matthews for over a year before she left Alabama. The relationship had begun during marriage counseling sessions, where Robert had taken advantage of her emotional vulnerability following her husband's death from cancer. Rebecca claimed that Robert had told her he was planning to leave Sarah, that their marriage had been a facade for years, and that he was only staying with her to protect his ministerial career and maintain custody of their children. Even more shocking was Rebecca's claim that Robert had known about Sarah's affair with Thomas for at least 2 months before the night of the shooting. According to Rebecca, Robert had confided in her that he was using knowledge of the affair as leverage to keep Sarah from filing for divorce, threatening to expose her relationship and destroy her reputation in the community if she tried to leave him. Rebecca provided Detective Henderson with text messages, emails, and photographs that seemed to corroborate her claims about her relationship with Robert. This revelation completely changed the narrative of the case from a spontaneous crime of passion to what appeared to be a calculated act of violence by a man who had been planning his revenge for months. If Rebecca's account was accurate, then Robert's surprise discovery of the affair had been completely fabricated, and his decision to kill Thomas had been premeditated rather than impulsive. Detective Henderson immediately began investigating Rebecca's claims, and what she discovered was even more disturbing than the original allegations. Church financial records showed that Robert had been using church funds to pay for hotel rooms, dinners, and gifts for Rebecca, embezzling thousands of dollars over the course of their relationship. He had also been using his position as pastor to manipulate other vulnerable women in the congregation, though Rebecca was apparently the only one with whom he had had a physical affair. The investigation revealed that Robert had installed surveillance equipment in his own home, secretly recording Sarah and Thomas's intimate encounters and collecting evidence of their affair for months. The recordings, which were discovered hidden in Robert's church office, showed that he had been watching and listening to his wife's betrayal with what appeared to be cold calculation rather than emotional devastation. Even more chilling was the discovery of a detailed journal that Robert had been keeping, documenting his plans for confronting Sarah and Thomas. The journal revealed that Robert had considered several different scenarios for revenge, including exposing the affair publicly during a Sunday service, blackmailing Thomas for money, and even hiring someone to assault Thomas as a warning. The final entries in the journal, written just days before the shooting, described his decision that the only satisfactory resolution would be Thomas's death. The journal also revealed Robert's belief that killing Thomas would solve all of his problems simultaneously. He would be rid of the man who had stolen his wife, Sarah would be traumatized into staying with him, and the community would view him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The entries showed a level of narcissistic calculation that was completely at odds with his public image as a man driven to temporary insanity by betrayal. When confronted with this evidence, Robert's defense attorney immediately moved to suppress the journal and recordings, arguing that they had been obtained without proper warrants. However, the prosecution argued that the evidence had been discovered in plain sight during the execution of a valid search warrant for Robert's office, and that the materials were directly relevant to establishing premeditation and motive. Sarah Matthews was devastated by the revelation that her husband had been recording her most intimate moments and planning Thomas's murder for months. She had genuinely believed that Robert had been unaware of the affair, and that his violent reaction had been spontaneous. Learning that he had been manipulating the situation from the beginning, allowing the affair to continue while he planned his revenge, made her realize that the man she had been married to for 18 years was a complete stranger to her. The community's reaction to these revelations was one of complete betrayal and horror. The image of Robert Matthews as a respected spiritual leader was completely shattered, replaced by the reality of a manipulative predator who had used his position to exploit vulnerable women and had planned the cold-blooded murder of a man who had considered him a friend. Church attendance at Grace Community Baptist dropped to nearly zero, and the congregation voted to close the church permanently rather than try to rebuild their reputation. Thomas Bradley's family, who had been struggling to understand how their loved one had become involved in such a destructive situation, now realized that he may have been as much a victim of Robert's manipulation as anyone else. The revelation that Robert had been allowing and possibly encouraging the affair while secretly planning Thomas's death made them question whether Thomas had ever really had a choice in the matter, or whether he had been drawn into a trap from which there was no escape. The prosecution's case was now much stronger, with clear evidence of premeditation that made the death penalty a real possibility. Robert's defense team scrambled to develop a new strategy, arguing that the journal and recordings showed a man who had suffered a complete psychological breakdown rather than someone who was coldly calculating murder. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the effects of betrayal trauma and the ways in which discovery of adultery could trigger temporary insanity, even in someone who had been aware of the affair on some level. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. As investigators continued to dig deeper into Robert's background and psychological profile, they discovered evidence that suggested Thomas Bradley might not have been Robert's first victim. Cold case detectives began reviewing unsolved deaths and disappearances from communities where Robert had previously served as pastor, looking for patterns that might indicate a history of violence that had been hidden behind his ministerial facade. The investigation into Robert's past would reveal connections to at least 3 suspicious deaths over the previous 15 years, including the apparent suicide of a young woman who had been receiving marriage counseling from Robert, and the mysterious disappearance of a church treasurer who had been questioning financial irregularities in church accounts. While no definitive proof was ever established linking Robert to these cases, the pattern was disturbing enough to raise serious questions about whether the murder of Thomas Bradley had been an isolated incident or part of a much larger pattern of violence and manipulation. But just when prosecutors thought they had built an unshakable case for premeditated murder, Robert's defense team announced that they had discovered evidence that would completely change how people understood the events of that October evening. The revelation they were about to make would shock everyone involved in the case and raise questions about whether justice could ever truly be served in such a complex web of deception and manipulation. The trial of Robert Matthews began on a scorching July morning, 8 months after the shooting that had shattered multiple families and destroyed a church community. The courthouse in Culman was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside to hear the testimony that would finally reveal the complete truth about what had happened between the pastor, his wife, and his best friend. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Torres, was confident that they had built an overwhelming case for premeditated murder that would result in either the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. But in his opening statement, Defense Attorney David Richardson dropped a bombshell that stunned everyone in the courtroom. According to Richardson, the prosecution had the basic facts of the case completely wrong. Robert Matthews hadn't murdered Thomas Bradley in a fit of rage or as part of a calculated revenge plot. Instead, Richardson claimed Robert had killed Thomas Bradley in self-defense after discovering that Thomas was physically abusing Sarah and had threatened to kill both of them if Robert interfered with their relationship. This new narrative was supported by previously undisclosed medical records showing that Sarah had been treated for injuries consistent with domestic violence on 3 separate occasions in the months leading up to Thomas's death. The records, which had been sealed due to Sarah's requests for confidentiality, showed bruises, a fractured rib, and facial injuries that Sarah had attributed to accidents, but which medical personnel had suspected were the result of abuse. Even more shocking was the testimony of Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist who had been secretly treating Sarah for what she described as severe trauma related to an abusive relationship. According to Dr. Williams, Sarah had been living in terror of Thomas Bradley, who had become increasingly violent and controlling as their affair had progressed. Sarah had wanted to end the relationship multiple times, but Thomas had threatened to kill her and expose the affair to destroy her family if she tried to leave him. The defense presented evidence that Thomas Bradley had a history of violence against women that had been carefully concealed from his friends and church community. His ex-wife, testifying via video link from her home in another state, finally revealed that their marriage had ended not because of infidelity, but because of Thomas's escalating physical abuse. She had remained silent for years out of fear, but was now willing to testify about the pattern of violence that had eventually driven her to flee Alabama with their children. According to the defense's reconstruction of events, Robert had returned home that October evening not to find his wife in a consensual affair, but to discover Thomas in the process of sexually assaulting Sarah. The sounds Robert had heard from the bedroom weren't passion, but Sarah's muffled cries for help as Thomas forced himself on her. When Robert burst through the door, Thomas had immediately attacked him, and the shooting had occurred during a physical struggle in which Robert was fighting for his life and trying to protect his wife. This version of events was supported by previously overlooked forensic evidence, including defensive wounds on Robert's hands and arms that were consistent with a physical struggle, and the positioning of Thomas's body, which suggested he had been moving toward Robert when the first shot was fired. The defense also pointed to Sarah's behavior immediately after the shooting, arguing that her hysterical emotional state was more consistent with relief after being rescued from an assault than with grief over losing a lover. Sarah's testimony when she finally took the stand was devastating in its emotional impact. She described months of escalating abuse at the hands of Thomas Bradley, who had gradually transformed from a charming and attentive lover into a violent and controlling predator. She claimed that she had been trying to end the affair for weeks before Robert's return, but that Thomas had threatened to kill her entire family if she refused to continue the relationship. According to Sarah, Thomas had become obsessed with the idea of destroying Robert and taking over his position in both the church and the family. He had been pressuring Sarah to help him find ways to discredit Robert professionally, to access church financial records, and to support false allegations of abuse that would destroy Robert's ministerial career. When Sarah had refused to participate in these schemes, Thomas's abuse had escalated to the point where she feared for her life. The most chilling part of Sarah's testimony was her description of the events immediately before Robert's arrival. She claimed that Thomas had forced his way into the house that evening, had physically assaulted her, and had been in the process of sexually assaulting her when Robert appeared in the doorway. She insisted that Robert's intervention had saved her life, and that Thomas would have killed her that night if her husband hadn't returned home unexpectedly. The prosecution fought back aggressively, arguing that this new narrative was a fabrication designed to generate sympathy for Robert and justify what was clearly premeditated murder. They pointed to the extensive evidence of Robert's planning and preparation, including the surveillance equipment, the detailed journal, and his history of manipulation and abuse. District Attorney Torres argued that Sarah's testimony was the result of coaching by the defense team and was contradicted by months of evidence showing a consensual affair. But the defense's case gained credibility when they presented testimony from Dr. Alan Hughes, a forensic psychologist who had reviewed all of the evidence, Sarah's medical records, and Robert's journal. Dr. Hughes testified that while the journal and surveillance equipment showed disturbing levels of control, they were also consistent with a man in the grip of paranoia and betrayal trauma rather than cold, calculated planning. He argued that Robert's actions on the night of the shooting were driven not by premeditation, but by a chaotic mixture of rage, fear, and an instinct to protect his wife from further harm. The trial dragged on for nearly 6 weeks, with jurors listening to hours of conflicting testimony about whether Robert Matthews was a grieving husband pushed beyond reason, or a manipulative predator who had orchestrated the events leading to Thomas Bradley's death. The courtroom was often packed with church members, some wearing buttons that read "Pray for Pastor Robert," while others carried signs demanding justice for Thomas. When the case finally went to the jury, the deliberations lasted 4 days. On the morning of the verdict, the entire town of Culman seemed to hold its breath. Reporters from across the country filled the courthouse, waiting to see whether the pastor would spend the rest of his life behind bars or walk away a free man. The jury's decision shocked nearly everyone. They found Robert Matthews guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not premeditated murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison, citing both the overwhelming betrayal Robert had experienced and the evidence of his troubling behavior. It was a compromise verdict that left no one fully satisfied. Thomas Bradley's family wept openly, believing justice had fallen short, while Robert's supporters felt relieved he had avoided the death penalty. Sarah Matthews never returned to Culman. After testifying in her husband's defense, she moved permanently to Birmingham, where she filed for divorce and attempted to rebuild her life away from the glare of national headlines. The Matthews children were left shattered. Michael withdrew from the army after struggling with PTSD-like symptoms, while Jennifer eventually returned to Auburn, but never spoke publicly about her parents again. Grace Community Baptist Church closed its doors within months of the verdict. Membership had collapsed, and the once thriving congregation chose to dissolve rather than attempt to rebuild its reputation. The building still stands, empty and decaying, a haunting reminder of how one night of betrayal destroyed not just 3 lives, but an entire faith community. As for Robert Matthews, he began serving his sentence at Limestone Correctional Facility, where he reportedly leads Bible studies for other inmates. To this day, he maintains that he was pushed into a moment of madness, that he acted out of love, betrayal, and desperation rather than malice. Whether that's true or not may never be fully known. In the end, the story of Pastor Robert Matthews is a tragic reminder of how quickly trust can turn into betrayal, and how betrayal can ignite violence that destroys everything in its path. Was he a victim of unbearable provocation, or a manipulator hiding behind the mask of a man of God? Was Sarah a wife trapped between 2 men, or an architect of her own downfall? And was Thomas Bradley a predator, a victim, or simply a man who made a catastrophic mistake? The answers may never be clear, but what is certain is this: in a quiet Alabama town, a marriage, a ministry, and a community were left in ruins, and the scars will last far longer than any prison sentence.